It began with Henry Lawrence, a local schoolteacher who vanished during a routine hike on a well-trodden path. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches, no footprints left behind, just his backpack and a single shoe left near the edge of a deep ravine. At first, people thought it was an accident. But then, over the next few months, more people began to disappear. A nurse on her way home from work, a couple walking their dog, a teenager on her evening jog. All vanished without a trace. The police were baffled. Nothing seemed to connect the disappearances, except for the eerie fact that none of the missing were ever found. No bodies, no clues, just empty homes and unanswered questions. As rumors began to spread and the town grew more anxious, a cryptic letter arrived at the local sheriff's office. The letter contained a single phrase: "The path is forgotten, but the town will remember." With this chilling message, Sheriff Caroline Davis knew something far more sinister was at play, and the truth behind these disappearances was buried deeper than anyone could imagine. Welcome back to Storiosity's videos. The town of Silverstone had always been peaceful. Its residents, content with their quiet lives and the slow-paced rhythm of rural life. The wide open fields, dense forests, and the calming presence of Silverstone Creek had been a backdrop for decades of familiarity. That was until Henry Lawrence, a well-liked and respected schoolteacher, disappeared one evening after setting out for a hike along his usual route. Henry had made the same trek countless times before, through the woods that bordered Silverstone Creek, a path familiar to many of the locals. When Henry didn't return home that evening, his wife Anna was the first to raise the alarm. The search party was quick to form, and by morning, local authorities had mobilized with tracking dogs and volunteers. The path was a well-worn trail, and Henry knew it well, so it was hard to believe that he could have strayed far. But there were no signs of him. No calls for help, no cries or screams. Just his backpack, carefully placed beside a large oak tree, and one abandoned shoe near the ravine that led to Silverstone Creek. It was as if Henry had simply vanished. The search continued for days, but Henry was never found. Rumors began to circulate around town. Some whispered about strange lights seen in the sky near the forest the night Henry went missing. Others spoke of old stories from generations past, stories about people disappearing without a trace, their fates never explained. Sheriff Caroline Davis tried to dismiss these rumors at first, focusing on the practical side of the investigation. But as days passed and no lead surfaced, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. The feeling that perhaps Silverstone wasn't as safe as it once seemed. Then, a week after Henry's disappearance, a strange letter arrived at the sheriff's office. The letter had no return address, and the handwriting was sharp and uneven. Inside, there was only one sentence: "The path is forgotten, but the town will remember." Sheriff Davis studied the note, her unease growing. She knew in that moment that the disappearance of Henry Lawrence wasn't an isolated event. The town was about to be drawn into a mystery that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their quiet little world. Sheriff Caroline Davis sat alone in her office that evening, staring at the cryptic letter she had received just hours before. The words, "The path is forgotten, but the town will remember," echoed in her mind. They seemed so simple, yet carried a weight of foreboding that she couldn't shake. It had been a week since Henry Lawrence had vanished, and despite an exhaustive search, there was still no sign of him. The woods had been combed, the creek had been dredged, and yet nothing. No footprints, no clues, no trace. Just his abandoned backpack and the unsettling image of his one shoe lying by the ravine. It wasn't just Henry anymore. Caroline thought back to the other missing persons in Silverstone. 3 more residents had gone missing over the past year, all of them under strange and inexplicable circumstances. A nurse named Clara Mitchell had disappeared on her way home from work. The police had found her car parked near her house, the engine still running, but there was no sign of Clara. Then there was the young couple, Ben and Alice Green, who were last seen walking their dog by the creek. They were never found, and the dog returned home alone, with its leash still intact. Caroline shivered at the thought. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed like there was a pattern. Though she couldn't put her finger on it, the town had started to change in small but noticeable ways. There was a nervous energy in the air, a sense of unease that hadn't been there before. People began avoiding the woods and the creek. The local shopkeepers looked over their shoulders, wary of the stranger who might be lurking just out of view. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the next person to vanish. Caroline had always prided herself on being able to maintain control in even the most chaotic situations, but this was different. She couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was unfolding in Silverstone, and she had a gut feeling that the answer was buried in the woods, waiting to be uncovered. The next morning, Caroline called for a meeting with her deputies and a few of the local volunteers who had helped search for Henry. She needed a fresh perspective, someone who could see things from a different angle. The letter still weighed heavily on her mind. She had to find out who wrote it, who knew about the path, the one that had been forgotten. The truth was out there, but it was hiding, and Caroline wasn't going to let it stay buried for long. There was more to this mystery, something deeper that ran beneath the surface of Silverstone, and she was going to uncover it. She just hoped she wasn't too late, Sheriff Caroline. Davis gathered a small group of her deputies and volunteers in the town hall. It was a makeshift operation at best, but it was all they had. As the meeting room filled with familiar faces, she could feel the weight of their silent expectations. This wasn't just another search mission. It was becoming a question of the town's future. The disappearance of Henry Lawrence, along with the others, had begun to haunt Silverstone, and people were growing desperate for answers. Caroline cleared her throat and placed the letter on the table for all to see. The handwritten words were like a challenge, a puzzle no one had yet been able to solve. The path is forgotten, but the town will remember. She repeated the words aloud, watching as the group exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't just the cryptic message that bothered Caroline. It was the realization that this wasn't the first time something strange had happened in Silverstone. "We've heard the old stories," Deputy Mark Jennings spoke up, his voice low but deliberate. "The ones about people who disappeared decades ago. Folks used to say that sometimes people just vanish into the woods, and no one knows why." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, as if weighing whether or not to continue. "But there's one thing no one ever talks about anymore. The path that leads to the old mill site on the east side of town. It's been abandoned for years. We're told it's dangerous, but I've heard some say that there's more to it than that." Caroline leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. She had heard whispers about the old mill, but most people in town dismissed it as folklore. "What are you suggesting, Mark?" she asked. "That the disappearances are connected to this old mill?" Mark nodded slowly. "It's an old story from the founding of the town. The first settlers were said to have disappeared near that path. After that, people stopped going there. Some say it's cursed, that the forest doesn't allow people to leave once they go too far in. I know it sounds ridiculous, but when I was a kid, I overheard my grandmother say the town was built on something ancient, something forgotten. A chill ran through Caroline. The town's past was shrouded in mystery, and as she looked around the room, she could see the weight of history bearing down on everyone. The disappearances weren't random, and whatever was happening now seemed to be linked to something much older. It's time we stop treating these as isolated incidents, Caroline said, her voice firm. I'm going to investigate the mill site. We need to know if there's any truth to these stories. And if there is, we need to find out what's causing these disappearances before anyone else gets taken. The room fell silent, the reality of her words settling in. Everyone knew that what Caroline was suggesting was dangerous. The mill site was abandoned for a reason, and no one had dared go near it in years. But Caroline knew that in order to solve the mystery of Silverstone, she had to follow the trail wherever it led. The first light of dawn painted the sky a pale pink as sheriff. Caroline Davis set out toward the mill site. She had gathered a small team of volunteers, all local residents who knew the town's history, and a couple of her deputies who had insisted on accompanying her. They stood at the edge of the town, the familiar rows of houses fading into the distance behind them. The air felt heavier here, like the land itself was holding its breath. The fog that had been a constant companion over the past few weeks seemed to cling to the trees, wrapping the woods in an eerie veil. As Caroline led the way down a narrow, overgrown path that cut through the forest, the others followed in silence. No one spoke much, the weight of the task ahead of them too heavy to be light. The path was barely visible beneath the thick foliage, a series of indistinct footprints and worn edges. "It's strange," said Deputy Mark Jennings, breaking the silence. "I've walked this path dozens of times, but today it feels ... different." Caroline nodded, her eyes scanning the area around them. "It's like the forest has been waiting for us," she murmured, the feeling of being watched creeping up her spine. They continued onward in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet and the occasional call of a distant bird. As they approached the end of the trail, the trees began to thin, revealing a clearing where the old mill stood. The mill was much older than Caroline had expected. Weathered by time, its stone walls were cracked and overgrown with vines. The roof had collapsed long ago, and what was once a bustling industrial site now sat as a crumbling relic. The air around it felt still, unnatural in its quietness. "This place hasn't been used in over 50 years, said one of the volunteers, a local historian, but the stories go back much further. Some say the mill is the heart of this town's darkest secrets." Caroline felt a shiver run down her spine as she approached the mill. Whatever it was that had started the pattern of disappearances in Silverstone, she was sure it was tied to this place. "We need to get inside," she said, her voice steady despite the growing unease. The team nodded and followed her toward the rotting doors. Whatever they were about to uncover, they all knew it could change everything. The creaking of old wood echoed through the air as Sheriff Caroline Davis pushed open the rotting doors of the mill. The scent of dampness and decay hit her immediately, but she forced herself to step inside. The faint glow of daylight filtered through the broken roof, casting long shadows over the remnants of machinery that once powered the mill. It was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the faint rustling of leaves outside and the occasional drip of water somewhere in the distance. The team followed closely, their flashlights piercing the gloom. The walls were lined with old tools and debris, rusted and forgotten. But as they moved further into the building, Something caught Caroline's eye, a faint, almost imperceptible symbol carved into one of the support beams. She stepped closer to investigate. The symbol was crude, but unmistakable. A circle with several smaller circles inside, each connected by thin lines. It looked like a map, or perhaps a diagram, but what it was meant to represent. Caroline couldn't say. "We need to document this," Caroline said, taking a picture of the symbol with her phone. She stepped back and glanced around the mill again. The more she saw, the more she realized how little she understood about the history of this place. "Let's split up," she suggested. "Search the area for any clues, anything unusual," as the group began to fan out. One of the volunteers, an older man named Thomas, called out from the far end of the room. "Sheriff, over here." Caroline hurried over, her heart racing. When she reached him, he was standing in front of a wall of stacked crates, his flashlight illuminating something peculiar. There was a narrow gap between two of the crates, and behind it, a small door hidden in the wall. Caroline's eyes widened. "How did we miss this?" she asked. The door was old, the wood warped and covered in dust. It was clearly not part of the original design. Caroline stepped forward, carefully pulling the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, revealing a dark, narrow hallway that led downward. "I'll go first," she said, and without waiting for a response, she stepped into the darkness. The others followed, their flashlights bouncing off the walls as they descended the stairs. The air grew cooler as they went deeper into the earth, and a sense of unease settled in Caroline's stomach. Something about this hidden room felt like it had been waiting for them to find it. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with more symbols, and in the center of the room was a strange, circular pedestal. On top of it was an old, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. Caroline approached it cautiously, a chill creeping up her spine. This was no ordinary book, it was a ledger, or perhaps a journal. The entries, written in tight, meticulous handwriting, seemed to go back hundreds of years, and as Caroline flipped through the pages, she realized that the names of the missing from Silverstone were written within. "We need to take this back to the station," Caroline said, her voice heavy with realization. The book was more than just a record, it was a key to unlocking the dark secret that had plagued Silverstone for generations. Back at the sheriff's office, Caroline sat at her desk, the leather-bound ledger open before her. She ran her fingers over the delicate pages, careful not to tear the old paper. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. She had locked the doors behind her, ensuring no one would disturb her while she worked through the entries. The book contained a detailed record of names, dates, and odd descriptions, but what stood out most was the pattern. Each name was accompanied by a location, some familiar, others marked by unfamiliar symbols or cryptic references to places that didn't exist on any map. Caroline's eyes skimmed down the pages, each name representing someone who had vanished in Silverstone. Henry Lawrence was listed near the top, with a note written beside his name. Disappeared in the woods near Silverstone Creek. Witnesses report seeing lights in the sky the night he vanished. Below Henry's entry was another. Clara Mitchell, the nurse, who had disappeared while walking home from the hospital. Her entry read, "Vanished on Main Street. No trace left behind, but strange marks found near her car door." The entries continued in this fashion, each person's disappearance recorded with chilling precision. But what made Caroline's stomach twist was the realization that the ledger was far older than anyone had imagined. The dates went back over a century, each disappearance marking a pattern that spanned generations. The dates aligned with periods of strange phenomena in the town's history, unexplained lights in the sky, odd weather patterns, and, most disturbingly, the same symbols appearing near the site of each disappearance. As Caroline continued to flip through the pages, a sudden thought crossed her mind. If this book contained records of disappearances spanning over 100 years, then it was possible that there were other towns, other communities that had experienced similar events. Was this part of a larger pattern? Was Silverstone just one of many towns affected by whatever force was causing these disappearances? The thought sent a shiver down Caroline's spine, but it also sparked something inside her, a need for answers. She couldn't allow this mystery to remain unsolved, not when so many innocent people had vanished. The ledger was no longer just a record, it was a map, a guide to uncovering the truth. Just as Caroline was about to read further, the phone on her desk rang, cutting through the quiet. She answered quickly, her voice steady despite the weight of the book in front of her. "Sheriff Davis," she said. "Caroline," came the voice on the other end. It was Mark Jennings, her deputy. "We found something. Something in the woods. You need to see this." Caroline's heart raced. "What is it?" "Come quick," Mark replied, his tone grave. "It's about the disappearances, and it's linked to the book." Caroline slammed the ledger shut, grabbed her jacket, and rushed out of the office. This was it. The truth was within reach, and whatever they were about to find in the woods, it would reveal what had been hidden for so long. The sky was already turning grey as Caroline drove out of town. The trees on either side of the road thick with the mist that seemed to forever cling to the land. Mark had said he found something in the woods, but he hadn't specified exactly what it was. All Caroline knew was that this could be the breakthrough she'd been waiting for. The book, the missing persons, the cryptic letters, all of it was beginning to tie together. And now Mark was calling her to the woods, a place that had already swallowed so many lives. When she arrived at the edge of the forest, Mark was standing next to his truck, his expression tense. "What did you find?" Caroline asked, stepping out of her vehicle and walking toward him. "Over here," Mark said, leading her toward the thickest part of the woods. They pushed through the underbrush, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath their boots the only sound in the heavy silence. After several minutes of walking, they reached a clearing. Caroline's eyes narrowed as she took in the sight before her. The ground was disturbed, as if something or someone had been dragged across it. But it wasn't the disturbed earth that caught her attention. It was the markings. On the trees around the clearing, large symbols had been carved into the bark. They were the same symbols from the ledger, the ones that had been associated with the missing persons, and now they were all around her. Caroline approached one of the trees and traced the carved lines with her fingers. "It's the same," she whispered. The symbols were arranged in a pattern, but their meaning was still unclear. Yet the eerie feeling that had settled over her grew stronger as she stood in the center of the clearing. Mark stepped closer, holding something in his hand. It was a small, weathered journal, similar to the one Caroline had found in the mill. "I found this hidden beneath one of the trees," he said, handing it to her. Caroline opened it carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages. The journal was older than the ledger, its pages fragile with age. As she read the first few entries, her heart sank. The journal belonged to someone from Silverstone's past, someone who had documented the very same disappearances that had started the chain of events. The entries detailed strange occurrences, disappearances, unusual lights in the sky, and sightings of people in the woods who seemed to belong there. The most disturbing entry, however, was dated over 100 years ago, and it read, "The town's memory is fading. The Watchers return every few decades to claim what they left behind. The path must remain hidden, or all will be forgotten." Caroline's pulse quickened as she read those words. This is bigger than we thought," she muttered. Whoever had written this knew about the disappearances, and more importantly, they knew about the patterns that stretched far beyond the town of Silverstone. "We need to find out who wrote this," Caroline said, her voice resolute. "This journal is our next piece of the puzzle. It's all connected. But we need to go back to the town's history, find out what they knew." As she turned to leave the clearing, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were still watching them, waiting for something. The sense of being observed had grown stronger since the journal had surfaced. Caroline knew that they were on the brink of uncovering something that could change everything. But she also knew that the deeper they dug, the more dangerous the truth would become. The town archives were quiet when Caroline entered, the smell of old paper and dust filling the air. She was accompanied by Mark, who had insisted on helping her piece together the town's forgotten history. The sheriff had instructed him to go through any historical records that might explain the strange occurrences, the symbols, and most importantly, the disappearance of so many people. They worked for hours, combing through boxes of documents, photos, and town records that hadn't been touched in years. The older files were brittle and yellowed, difficult to read, but there was a sense of urgency driving them both. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered about the town's shadowed past. Newspaper clippings from the late 1800s detailed strange events, local legends about figures seen in the woods, and disappearances that went unreported. Stories passed down through generations, but largely dismissed as folklore. One article stood out, though. It described an event that occurred in 1887, when several families in Silverstone mysteriously vanished, their homes found abandoned and untouched. Much like the recent cases, Mark read aloud from the article. The people who left never returned, and no one knows where they went. But some claim to have seen figures in the fog, dark shapes moving between the trees, and lights hovering in the distance at night. A strange silence followed their departure, and the town began to forget what had happened. Caroline frowned. "This is exactly what we've been seeing. The disappearances have happened in cycles, and each time it seems to involve the same elements: disappearances, strange lights, and eerie silence afterward. What's more troubling is that this article says that the town began to forget. What if it's happening again?" As Caroline flipped through more records, she found references to something that had been mentioned in the journal she and Mark found in the woods, the path. The term appeared in several old town documents, but it was always mentioned in passing, with no clear explanation. In one letter, an early settler wrote, "The path must remain hidden. If the town forgets it, the Watchers will return to claim what they left behind." "This is starting to sound like a pattern," Caroline said, a chill creeping down her spine. "We're dealing with something much older than we thought. Something that goes back to the founding of Silverstone." Just then, Mark found something that made Caroline's blood run cold: a map. It was drawn by one of the town's original settlers, and it depicted an area deep in the woods, near the site of the old mill. The map was dotted with peculiar symbols that matched the ones they had seen carved into the trees and mentioned in the ledger. At the center of the map was a marked location, labeled only as the Hollow. "That's where we need to go," Caroline said, her voice low with determination. The hollow. Whatever happened here all those years ago, it's tied to that place. As they gathered the map and prepared to leave, Caroline couldn't help but feel the weight of the town's forgotten history bearing down on them. It was clear now that Silverstone's secrets were buried deep, and they were just beginning to scratch the surface. But the deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. The closer they got to discovering what had been hidden for generations. The air was thick with mist as Caroline and Mark stood at the edge of the woods, staring at the map in their hands. The path they were about to take led into the heart of Silverstone's forgotten land, a place that had been marked on the old map as the Hollow. No one in town talked about it. It was as if the very name had been erased from memory. But now, as they stood on the precipice of uncovering the truth, the weight of the past seemed to press in on them. We've been walking around the edges of this town, looking for answers, Caroline said, her voice steady but edged with anticipation. But it all leads here. The Hollow is the key to understanding why people are vanishing and what's happening to this town. Mark nodded, his eyes scanning the tree line. I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. It's like the woods are alive, aware of us. It's unsettling. I know what you mean, Caroline replied, her gaze narrowing. This place feels different from the rest of the woods, more controlled, like it's been waiting for us to come. They began their trek into the forest, the map guiding their every step. As they moved deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting and contorting into shapes that almost looked deliberate. The further they went, the more Caroline felt as though they were crossing some invisible threshold, a line that once crossed could never be undone. After what felt like hours of walking, they arrived at a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone circle, its edges worn smooth by time and the elements. The stones were covered in moss and ivy, but they were unmistakably deliberate in their placement. Caroline felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped closer to the circle. It was exactly like the symbols they had seen in the mill, in the ledger, and carved into the trees. This is it, Caroline said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is where it all started. This is the Hollow. Mark stepped forward, running his fingers along one of the stones. What was this place used for? He asked. It doesn't look like anything natural. Caroline surveyed the area, her mind racing. This wasn't just a meeting place. This was something ritualistic. Whoever built this circle, they wanted something to happen here. And I think we're standing on the edge of it. She knelt down and ran her fingers along the ground near the stone circle, her eyes scanning for any signs of something hidden. And then she found it, a small, weathered box, partially buried beneath the dirt. With a quick tug, she pulled it free and opened it. Inside was a collection of strange items, more symbols, handwritten notes, and a final piece of the puzzle, a drawing of Silverstone, with a large, dark circle marking the center of the town. The words "the path" were written next to it, as if warning those who would come after. Caroline stared at the drawing, the realization sinking in. This wasn't just about the missing people, she murmured. This is about the town itself. It's like they've been trying to cover something up for generations. And now, we've found the beginning of it. Mark looked at her, his face pale. But what does it all mean? What is the path? And why are we the ones who found it? Caroline stood up, clutching the box tightly. We don't have all the answers yet, but we're getting closer. And we're not leaving until we understand everything, with a new sense of purpose. They set their sights on uncovering the truth, knowing that whatever lay ahead in the Hollow, It was far darker and more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. The air in the clearing was thick with tension, the mist swirling around Caroline and Mark as they stood in the center of the ancient stone circle. The box they had found was heavy with significance, but its true meaning still eluded them. Caroline's mind raced as she examined the contents, notes, symbols, and the drawing of Silverstone with a dark circle at its heart, marked with the words, "The Path." The strange, cryptic message was clear enough. Whatever had been hidden in this town had been concealed for generations, and they were only beginning to scratch the surface. "We need to keep moving," Caroline said, her voice tight with urgency. She closed the box and secured it in her bag. "The answers are here, and we can't afford to waste time." Mark nodded, though his face was pale and grim. "I don't like this, Caroline. The more we uncover, the more I feel like we're walking into something we won't be able to walk out of." Caroline met his gaze, her expression resolute. "We don't have a choice. People are disappearing. Families are being torn apart, and the truth is buried here in these woods. We have to finish this. For Silverstone." They left the clearing, their footsteps silent on the forest floor as they followed the map's markings deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to grow denser, their trunks twisting in unnatural ways, as if guiding them forward. The air grew cooler with every step, the weight of the town's forgotten history pressing on their shoulders. After an hour of walking, they arrived at a small, isolated cabin hidden deep within the forest. It looked abandoned, its windows shattered, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. But something about it felt strangely alive, as though it was waiting for them. Caroline felt a chill run through her as she approached the cabin. She could almost hear whispers in the wind, the same eerie murmurs that had followed them through the woods. "Is this it?" Mark asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and dread. Caroline nodded, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the door. "This is where it all connects. The path leads here. The answers are inside." With a sharp push, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with old furniture and dust-covered bookshelves. The air inside was stale, and the silence was almost deafening. Caroline stepped inside, her flashlight illuminating the room in short, jagged bursts. As she scanned the room, her eyes fell on an old desk in the corner, covered in more papers, maps, and journals. One journal, in particular, caught her attention. It was old, bound in cracked leather, with no title on the cover. She picked it up carefully and opened it. The first page was dated back to the early 1900s, and it read, "The path must remain secret. The watchers will return when the town forgets." Caroline's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the link between the strange disappearances, the cryptic messages, and the eerie symbols they had uncovered. Someone had been documenting this for years, maybe even decades, and it seemed that whoever was behind the disappearances had always known that the town's memory could be erased. The path was more than just a road, it was a memory, a buried history waiting to resurface. "We've uncovered something we shouldn't have," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. Caroline shut the journal, her mind racing. "No, Mark, we've uncovered everything we need. The town can't forget anymore. We're going to make sure of that." With the journal in hand, they left the cabin, the weight of their discovery hanging heavy in the air. The path had been uncovered, and there was no turning back now. Caroline and Mark walked back toward the clearing in silence, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. The journal, heavy with its dark history, was tucked securely in Caroline's bag, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The woods, which had once seemed so familiar, now felt foreign, as if they were crossing into a place where the normal rules of time and space no longer applied. The further they went, the more the air seemed to shift colder, thicker, almost charged with an unseen energy. The trees no longer stood in neat rows, but seemed to bend toward them, their gnarled branches casting strange, twisting shadows across the path. Every rustle of leaves made Caroline's pulse quicken. She was sure they were being followed, though every time she turned to look, there was nothing but the silent, oppressive woods stretching behind them. When they finally reached the town's edge, it was almost dark. The town of Silverstone, usually so quiet and sleepy at this hour, seemed unusually still. No lights in the windows, no sound of footsteps or conversation, only the faint hum of distant electricity. It felt as though the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "I don't like this," Mark said quietly, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "It's like the town's been waiting for us to return." Caroline didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked briskly toward the sheriff's office, knowing that they needed to act quickly. As she entered the office, she was met with the concerned faces of her deputies. "Sheriff, where have you been?" Deputy Thompson asked. "We've been getting strange calls from the locals. People are saying things have been happening. Odd things." Caroline's stomach sank. "What kind of things?" "The town's been changing," Thompson said, hesitating. "It's subtle, but it's there. People are forgetting things. Things that happened just a few days ago, even hours ago, are slipping from their minds. And well, this is the strangest part. People keep seeing flashes of light in the sky. Not like any storm I've ever seen. More like something ... moving." Caroline exchanged a look with Mark. The lights in the sky, the strange symbols, and now this. The pieces were falling into place, and they were closing in on the terrifying truth. Whatever was causing the disappearances wasn't just a series of isolated incidents, it was something far bigger. Something tied to the town itself. "We're not just dealing with missing people," Caroline said, her voice low but firm. "We're dealing with something that has been hiding in this town for generations. Something that's been waiting for the right moment to return. And now we're at that moment." Caroline took a deep breath and turned to the gathered deputies. "Prepare yourselves. We need to go back into the woods, back to the mill site. Everything we've uncovered, the journal, the symbols, the disappearances, it's all connected. And if we don't act now, we may lose the chance to stop it." The room was silent as Caroline's words sank in. The town had forgotten something important, something dangerous. The hollow wasn't just a place in the woods. It was a place in time, a memory that had been hidden away for far too long. They would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The sheriff's office was in chaos, with deputies gathering equipment and preparing for the journey back into the woods. Caroline's mind was racing. Every step forward now seemed like a step deeper into the unknown. The symbols they had found, the journal's chilling message, the lights in the sky, it was all leading them back to the mill site. It was no longer just a place where people had disappeared. It was the epicenter of something far more dangerous, something that had been hidden from the town for generations. Caroline checked her flashlight, making sure it was working, and grabbed a first aid kit. The weather had started to turn, and the thick fog had rolled back in. The town felt colder than it had ever been, and she couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched, even as they moved through the streets. Mark walked beside her, his expression grim. As he glanced nervously over his shoulder. "We're walking right into the heart of it, aren't we?" Mark asked, his voice quiet, as if speaking too loudly would make things worse. Caroline didn't answer at first. Instead, she focused on the path ahead. She had been in control of this case from the start, but now, as they approached the woods once more, she realized just how little she truly understood about what they were dealing with. The town, the disappearances, the strange phenomenon, it all felt like it was part of a much larger puzzle, one that no one had been able to solve for generations. "I think we are," she finally replied, "but we don't have a choice. We need to find the answers. For Silverstone, for everyone who's gone missing, we can't let this continue." The others had gathered around the cars, ready to follow. Caroline led the way into the woods, her footsteps crunching on the damp leaves. The fog thickened the deeper they went. And soon the path they had once walked felt unfamiliar, the trees casting long, twisted shadows in the eerie silence. As they reached the mill site, Caroline felt the unease grow stronger. The mill had once been a bustling industrial site, but now it stood abandoned, a relic of the past. The roof had caved in, the walls were cracked and weathered, but the sense of history here was undeniable. Something had happened at this place, and whatever it was tied to the very foundation of Silverstone. When they stepped inside, the familiar smell of rot and decay filled the air. Caroline's flashlight flickered as she scanned the room. The place had not changed since their last visit, the crumbling machinery, the broken windows. But as she stepped further into the heart of the mill, a strange feeling washed over her. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "We need to go deeper," Caroline said, her voice steady despite the growing tension. With their flashlights lighting the way, they moved toward the back of the mill, to where the floorboards creaked beneath their weight. In the corner, hidden behind a pile of debris, Caroline spotted something she hadn't noticed before: a trapdoor, its edges covered in dust and cobwebs. The air around it seemed unnaturally cold, as if the ground beneath them was hiding something important. "This is it," Caroline said, her heart pounding. She knelt down and slowly pried open the trapdoor. It revealed a narrow staircase leading downward into darkness. Mark stepped forward, a look of resolve on his face. "I'll go first," he said. "We don't know what's down there, but we need to face it, together." Caroline nodded, though a feeling of dread crept over her. They were about to descend into the unknown, into the heart of the mystery that had plagued their town. And she couldn't help but wonder, what would they find at the bottom? The air grew colder as Mark carefully descended the narrow staircase. The faint creaking of the old wood beneath their feet was the only sound in the pitch-black space below. Caroline and the others followed closely behind, the faint beams of their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The steps seemed to go on forever, twisting downward like the descent into some hidden, forgotten place. When they finally reached the bottom, they were met with an underground chamber, far larger than they had anticipated. The walls were lined with old stone, and the air was thick with a musty scent. The room was eerily quiet, except for the occasional drip of water coming from somewhere in the distance. As Caroline's flashlight scanned the room, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The walls were covered in the same symbols they had seen before, the ones from the woods, from the mill, and from the journal. "Are these the same markings?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Caroline nodded grimly. "Yes, they're everywhere. Whoever has been behind these disappearances, they've been here for a long time. This isn't just about people vanishing. This is about something much older. In the center of the chamber, there was a stone pedestal. The pedestal was covered in dust, but it looked like it had been untouched for years. However, as Caroline stepped closer, she noticed something peculiar, a small old key lying on top of the pedestal. It was made of iron, rusted with age, but unmistakably important. "Do you think it's for a lock?" Mark asked. Caroline didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the key, and her mind was racing. The key felt familiar, but she couldn't place why. She picked it up cautiously, the cold metal sending a shiver down her spine. As her fingers wrapped around the key, a sudden chill filled the air, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "There's a door," Caroline muttered under her breath, looking around the chamber for any sign of an exit. Her eyes finally landed on the far wall, where a small wooden door, nearly hidden in the shadows, stood slightly ajar. The key seemed to hum in her hand, as if guiding her toward it with a determined nod. She walked toward the door, Mark following close behind. The key fit perfectly into the old lock, and with a turn, the door creaked open. The room beyond was even darker, but the faintest light seemed to emanate from the far corner. Caroline stepped inside, and as her flashlight illuminated the space, she gasped. In front of them was a large, intricate map carved into the stone wall, its lines glowing faintly with an eerie light. It was a map of Silverstone. No, not just Silverstone. It stretched across the entire region, with dozens of red marks scattered across it, each corresponding to a location. And at the center of the map, the words "The Hollow" were written in large, bold letters. "This is it," Caroline whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is where it all started." As she took a step closer to the map, she realized that the red marks weren't just locations, they were dates. And the dates corresponded with every disappearance, every strange event in Silverstone's history. The pattern was undeniable. The town had been a target for decades, and each disappearance was part of a larger, more ominous plan. Mark looked at her, his face pale. "What is this? What are we dealing with?" Caroline stared at the map, the weight of the discovery settling in. "We're dealing with something that has been controlling this town for generations. Something that's been orchestrating the disappearances, ... And now, we're caught in the middle of it." The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The town, its history, its people, they were all part of a much larger, darker story. And the key she held in her hand, it was the key to unlocking a truth that had been buried for far too long. "We need to take this back," Caroline said, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. "We need to show everyone. The truth can't stay hidden any longer." But as they turned to leave, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening thud, plunging them into darkness. The door slammed shut with such force that Caroline and Mark were thrown off balance. The sound reverberated through the chamber, filling the air with an almost unnatural weight. Their flashlights flickered briefly before settling back into a steady beam. But the darkness that enveloped them now seemed thicker, more suffocating. The eerie hum from the key they had found seemed to vibrate in the walls around them, like an unseen force growing stronger by the second. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice tight with anxiety. His flashlight darted around the room, but the walls were as still and silent as ever. The door, it wasn't just the wind. It was like something pushed it shut. Caroline stood frozen for a moment, staring at the now locked door. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine, but she didn't let it show. "I know. Something doesn't want us to leave." Her mind raced as she considered their options. The room they were in felt more like a trap than a discovery. The map on the wall had unlocked some terrible realization, and now, it seemed, whatever dark force had haunted Silverstone was watching them, waiting for them to make a move. She turned back to the map. "We need to find out where the next step is," she said, her voice firm. "There's something we're missing. Something this map is trying to tell us." Mark stepped closer to the wall, examining the glowing red marks. "Every one of these dates matches up with a disappearance, but what's the significance of the hollow? Why is that the center of everything?" Caroline's flashlight flicked over the map once more, stopping at the hollow's marked location. The red lines radiated outward, connecting the town's secrets like threads in a web. But there was something else beneath the hollow's location, was an inscription, faint and nearly obscured by the centuries of dust and grime. Caroline leaned in closer, wiping the stone with her sleeve to get a better look. "It says the heart of the forgotten path," Caroline muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about missing people, it's about the town's memory itself. These disappearances, they're not random. They're connected to something deeper, something from the town's history." Mark's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "The path. The path that's been erased," Caroline replied, her mind racing. "The one mentioned in the journal we found at the mill. Whatever this path is, it's more than just a road or a location. It's a forgotten history. A piece of Silverstone's past that's been buried and erased over time. But it's not gone. It's still here, and it's drawing people in." Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled, a deep rumble vibrating through the stone floor. Caroline and Mark exchanged a glance before the trembling stopped just as suddenly as it had started. The silence in the chamber now felt oppressive, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. "Is this it?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "Is this the path?" Before Caroline could respond, the chamber seemed to shift around them. The map on the wall flickered and changed. The red lines began to pulse, as if alive, and the markings appeared to move. The glowing symbols blinked like stars in the night sky, connecting the dots across the map in real. And then, in a burst of light, the map exploded outward, revealing something hidden beneath it. A hidden door. Caroline's heart skipped a beat. The path was real, and it was leading them somewhere they weren't prepared to go. "We need to go." "Now," Caroline said urgently, stepping toward the door as the air around them thickened with the weight of what lay ahead. The air in the chamber was thick with anticipation as Caroline and Mark stepped toward the newly revealed door. It seemed to emerge from nowhere, hidden beneath the shifting map, as though the very walls were responding to their presence. Caroline's heart raced. She had known they were getting close to the truth, but she hadn't expected this, an actual passage hidden beneath the map, as if Silverstone itself had been concealing its darkest secrets. The door was old, its wood weathered and cracked with age, but the carvings on its surface were intricate, almost deliberate, symbols similar to those they had seen before, but this time they were deeper, more defined. Caroline's fingers traced the edges of the carvings, and the door creaked slightly, as if reacting to her touch. She looked back at Mark, whose face was pale, but determined. "This is it," Caroline said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling in her chest. "Whatever we find behind this door, it's the final piece of the puzzle. We can't turn back now." Mark nodded, though he couldn't hide the unease in his eyes. "Let's go." With a firm push, the door groaned open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit passageway. It was almost completely dark, save for the faint glow of what seemed to be an ethereal light coming from deeper within. The air inside was damp and cold, the walls coated with centuries of dust. The passage was tight, the stone walls close on either side, but Caroline stepped forward without hesitation. She could feel the weight of the mystery pressing on her, and she knew they had no choice but to move forward. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, Caroline's mind raced. The map, the symbols, the journal, it was all leading them here. But what was here? What had been hidden beneath Silverstone for so long? She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something ancient, something that had been forgotten by everyone in town, but had never truly been erased. The passage opened up ahead of them, revealing a large, cavernous room. The floor was made of smooth stone, the walls lined with shelves and ancient artifacts. The air was heavier here, almost suffocating, and the glow they had seen earlier seemed to come from a stone pedestal in the center of the room. On the pedestal sat an ornate box, old and weathered, with more symbols carved into its surface. Caroline stepped forward, her eyes locked on the box. It seemed to beckon her. "This is it," she said softly. "This is what they were hiding." Mark looked around nervously, as if expecting something to jump out at them from the shadows. "What's inside it?" Caroline hesitated for a moment, then carefully approached the pedestal. "I don't know yet, but I think it's the key to everything. The truth behind all the disappearances, the path, the town's forgotten history, it's all here." With a steady hand, she reached for the box, and as her fingers touched the cold surface, a low hum filled the air. The light in the room grew brighter, and for a moment it felt as if the entire cavern was alive, vibrating with energy. Caroline slowly lifted the lid of the box, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, there was a single piece of paper, yellowed with age. As Caroline unfolded it, her eyes scanned the delicate writing. The path must be followed. The Hollow's secret is not just one of time, but of memory. Once forgotten, it must be remembered. The Watchers wait for those who dare. Caroline's breath caught in her throat as the meaning behind the words began to sink in. This wasn't just about missing people. This was about Silverstone itself, a town caught between the past and the present, forgotten and remembered, in a cycle that had never been broken. Mark stepped forward. "What does it mean? What are the Watchers?" Caroline turned to him, her face pale but determined. "It means that we're not the only ones searching for answers. The Watchers have been waiting for someone to uncover the truth. And now that we've found it, the real question is, what happens next?" The cavern seemed to grow colder as she spoke, the weight of the words hanging heavily in the air. Caroline looked around, knowing they were not alone. The Watchers were closer than they realized. The cavern fell silent after Caroline's words, the heavy air pressing in on them as if the very stone walls were waiting for something to happen. Mark stepped back, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Caroline, too, felt the unsettling sensation that they were no longer alone. The words in the box, the mention of Watchers, felt more real now, as if the very walls around them had ears, watching and listening, waiting for the right moment. "Do you feel that?" Caroline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded slowly, his eyes darting nervously around the cavern. "Yeah, it's like something's here with us." Caroline's heart raced as she turned back to the pedestal, her mind trying to make sense of what they had uncovered. The Watchers, who were they? And what did they mean by the path must be followed? The words were haunting, filled with a promise of something dangerous if they continued, but there was no turning back now. They had found the center of it all, and whatever dark force had been lurking in Silverstone was waiting for them to make the next move. That is, Caroline turned to leave the cavern. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble lightly. The walls, once still and quiet, seemed to vibrate as if responding to their presence. The faint humming sound that had filled the room when she opened the box grew louder, vibrating in her bones. The pedestal where the box had been shifted slightly, revealing something that had been hidden beneath it, a narrow stone passageway that led deeper into the heart of the cavern. "This is it," Caroline whispered. The next part of the path. Mark stepped forward, his voice filled with hesitation. "We've come this far, Caroline, but whatever's down that path, it's not going to let us leave. You know that, right?" Caroline nodded grimly. "I know, but we have no choice. We're the ones who have uncovered it. Now we have to see it through." With no other options, they entered the passageway. The air grew colder, the walls narrower, as if the cavern was closing in on them. As they moved deeper, the light from their flashlights began to flicker, the shadows growing longer and more twisted. The further they went, the more Caroline's sense of unease grew. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking their every move. She could hear nothing but the steady beat of her own heart and the soft shuffle of Mark's footsteps behind her. Yet, the feeling that they weren't alone was undeniable. Finally, they reached the end of the passageway. What lay before them was more unsettling than anything they had encountered so far, a vast underground chamber, its walls lined with ancient symbols, some of which looked like the same ones that had appeared in the town, in the woods, and at the mill. But there was something else, 2 figures, shadowy, indistinct forms standing in the corners of the chamber, their outlines barely visible. The watchers. Caroline froze, her blood running cold. The figures were still, motionless, but there was a presence about them, an oppressive, almost suffocating weight that filled the room. They were not just shadows, they were something alive, something ancient and powerful. And as Caroline and Mark stepped into the room, the figures seemed to stir, their forms flickering in and out of existence, like the distortion of a broken reflection in a mirror. "This is it," Mark whispered. "This is what's been waiting for us." Caroline stood tall, her mind racing. The watchers were here, in the heart of the hollow, and they had been waiting for someone to come and uncover the truth. They had been watching Silverstone, its people, for generations. But the question remained, why? What were the watchers waiting for? And how were they connected to the town's long history of disappearances? As Caroline took a step forward, the figures in the chamber began to move slowly at first, their forms flickering like wisps of smoke, but then with more certainty, more purpose. They were not just lingering in the shadows anymore. They were coming closer. It was time for them to reveal the truth, and Caroline knew, deep in her bones, that nothing in Silverstone would ever be the same again. The figures in the chamber moved closer, their shadowy forms growing more solid with every passing second. Caroline could feel the temperature drop, the air growing thick with an unseen presence. The flickering lights from their flashlights seemed feeble against the growing darkness around them. The watchers, as they had been called, were not just passive observers, they were active, aware of their intrusion, and they were waiting. Mark stood close behind her, his breath shallow. "Caroline, what are they? What do they want?" Caroline swallowed hard, her mind racing to make sense of everything she had seen and learned. The symbols, The disappearances, the cryptic letters, it was all leading them here. To this moment, to these figures who seemed to exist outside of time. They weren't ghosts, nor were they human. They were something older, something tied to the land itself. And they had been here long before Silverstone was even founded. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I think we're about to find out." The watchers moved closer, their presence now unmistakable. As they came into clearer view, Caroline saw that they were not entirely physical. Their forms wavered, as though they were partially transparent, shifting in and out of focus. Their faces were indistinct, blurring with every flicker of light, but their eyes when they looked at her were piercing. They seemed to see into her very soul, as if they had been waiting for her specifically. Then, one of the figures stepped forward, its form solidifying just enough for Caroline to make out a faint silhouette. It wasn't a human figure, but rather something far more ancient, dressed in tattered robes that seemed to shimmer in the darkness. The figure extended a long, bony hand, pointing directly at Caroline. "The path has been uncovered," the figure spoke, its voice deep and reverberating, like the sound of distant thunder. "The time of forgetting is over." Caroline's heart raced as she stepped back, her mind struggling to comprehend the meaning behind the figure's words. "The time of forgetting. You've been watching us this whole time," Caroline said, the words barely escaping her lips. "You've been waiting for someone to uncover the truth. But why? Why the disappearances? What do you want?" The watcher's eyes seemed to glow faintly, as though it was looking into the very depths of her thoughts. The town was built upon the past, but its memory was erased. The path you uncovered is not just a physical route, it is the route through time itself. It leads to the forgotten memories of this land, to the people who once walked here. Mark stepped forward, his voice shaky. "And the disappearances? What happens to the people who vanish?" "They are taken to the edge of memory," the figure replied, its voice a low murmur that reverberated in the chamber. "To places where the past still lingers. Their bodies are not lost. They are held preserved in a state of half-memory, waiting for the path to be opened again." Caroline felt a chill grip her heart. "So the people who vanish, they're not dead?" "No," the watcher said, its form flickering. "They are forgotten, but they are not gone. They exist between the forgotten and the remembered, trapped in the space where time blurs." Caroline turned to Mark, her mind racing. The town's history was buried, erased, and now it was all coming back. "So, what happens now?" Caroline asked, facing the watcher again. "The cycle must be completed," the watcher said, its form growing even more ethereal, as if it were beginning to fade. "The path must remain open. The town cannot forget again. The watchers will remain, but the town's memory will hold." Caroline took a step back, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She understood now. The disappearances were part of a cycle, an ancient forgotten pattern that had been set in motion long before Silverstone had been built. The people who vanished were not lost, they were kept, held in a place between time, waiting to be remembered again. And now that they had uncovered the truth, the cycle was close to completion. "Will the disappearances end?" Mark asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. The figure gave no response, but as it faded into the shadows, Caroline felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The watchers had waited, and now they were retreating into the darkness, leaving her with the knowledge that the path, the memory of Silverstone, would never be the same again. She turned to Mark, her face set with determination. "We have to make sure the town remembers. We have to stop the cycle from repeating. Mark nodded, his expression resolute. Then let's make sure Silverstone never forgets again. As they left the chamber and made their way back toward the town, the first rays of dawn broke through the mist, casting a golden light over the woods. The watchers had disappeared, but their presence lingered in the air, a reminder that the town of Silverstone could never go back to what it once was. Caroline and Mark walked back toward Silverstone, their footsteps heavy on the earth beneath them. The town, which had seemed so ordinary just days ago, now felt like a distant memory, forever changed by what they had uncovered. The secrets buried beneath its roots, its history, were not just stories from the past, they were alive, moving in the shadows, and woven into the very fabric of the land itself. They had learned that Silverstone was part of a much larger pattern, one that stretched across time and memory, and one that now demanded to be remembered. As they approached the town's edge, Caroline glanced at Mark. "We need to tell everyone what we found," she said quietly. "We can't let it be forgotten again. The cycle has to end." Mark nodded, but his eyes were clouded with doubt. "But what if they don't believe us? What if they don't want to know?" Caroline paused, her thoughts swirling. She knew the town would be reluctant to accept the truth. They'd never been prepared for it, and many would probably dismiss it as nonsense. But the weight of the knowledge they had uncovered couldn't be ignored. People had gone missing. People had been taken, not just from the physical world, but from memory itself. The town had been in the grip of something ancient, something that had been waiting for the right time to resurface. "We don't have a choice, Mark," Caroline said firmly. "We have to make them see what's been happening. We have to stop this before more people are erased, before it starts all over again." As they entered Silverstone, the town appeared unchanged. The streets were quiet, the morning mist still hanging in the air, but there was something unsettling about the calm. The town, like the woods, felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting. Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the town was more aware of its own history than it had ever been before. The past wasn't truly gone, it had just been hidden, buried beneath layers of forgetting. Caroline made her way to the sheriff's office, where she found her deputies waiting. There was an unusual tension in the air, as if they knew something was coming, but no one spoke of it. As she entered, Caroline addressed them, her voice steady. "We've found the answers," she said, "and we need to act quickly before it's too late. Silverstone's history is not what we thought it was. People didn't just vanish, they were erased from memory. And the cycle of disappearances, the things that have been happening for generations, it's all connected to the path we've uncovered." The room fell silent. Her deputies exchanged uneasy glances. Caroline could see the skepticism in their eyes. But there was something more, a flicker of recognition, as if they, too, had begun to realize that the town had been hiding something all along. "Sheriff, are you saying that, ... people have been taken, but they're not really gone?" Deputy Thompson asked, his voice unsure. "Yes," Caroline replied, her gaze unwavering. "They've been held, forgotten, but they've never truly left. The path we uncovered leads to the Hollow, and the Hollow is the center of all of it, the place where Silverstone's memory lives, where the town's dark history is kept alive." Mark stepped forward, his face pale. "The disappearances are just the beginning. The Watchers are part of something older, something that ties this town to a much bigger story, a story that's been repeating itself for generations." The deputies exchanged nervous glances, but there was a shift in the room. Caroline could feel it. They were no longer questioning whether they should believe her. They were starting to understand that the truth was far more complicated than any of them had imagined. "We have to stop it," Caroline said. "We can't let the cycle start again. The town needs to remember. We need to make sure Silverstone never forgets again." As the room filled with a heavy silence, Caroline realized that the town wasn't just dealing with the past, it was dealing with the consequences of forgetting it. The watchers, the disappearances, the mysterious symbols, they were all connected. And Silverstone had been caught in a loop of its own history. The question now was, could they stop it before it happened again? Caroline stood at the front of the sheriff's office, surrounded by her deputies and a few of the town's most trusted residents. There was a sense of resolve in the room now, though the weight of what they were about to do was palpable. The truth was no longer something hidden away, it was out in the open, and now they had to act on it. The cycle of disappearances had stretched for generations, but the town of Silverstone had never fully understood what was happening to it. Now, that understanding was their responsibility, and it was up to them to end it. The key to breaking this cycle lies in the memory of the town, Caroline said, addressing the room. The Watchers have been manipulating Silverstone's past, erasing people from history itself, but they can only do so if we forget. We need to bring back what's been lost. Deputy Thompson looked concerned. But how? How do we make the town remember? Caroline glanced at the journal they had found in the mill, the journal that had been passed down through the years, detailing the disappearances and the path. The path isn't just physical. It's a part of the town's history, and it has to be acknowledged, remembered. We need to bring everyone back to the place where it all began. Mark stepped forward, his face serious. The hollow is the heart of it. The path must be retraced, and the town must face what it's forgotten. If we can do that, if we can make Silverstone remember, then the Watchers will lose their hold on us. Caroline nodded. Exactly. We need to gather everyone in the town and bring them to the mill site, to the hollow. Once we're there, we'll do everything we can to make them see the truth. Only then will the cycle be broken. The deputies and residents exchanged uneasy glances, but there was no more hesitation. They understood now that the town's survival depended on their actions, on facing the past head-on. They had to reclaim their memories before they were lost forever. The group set off toward the mill site as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the town. As they walked, Caroline couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were about to do. They were about to confront the very forces that had shaped Silverstone's history, forces that had quietly controlled the town for so long. But now, with the truth finally uncovered, they had a chance to change everything. When they arrived at the mill, Caroline stood at the entrance and turned to the group. The place that had once been a symbol of Silverstone's forgotten past was now the site of its redemption. "This is where the path begins," she said. "It's where the town's memory was lost, but it's also where we will make it right." The group stepped forward together, their footsteps echoing through the empty mill. As they reached the center, the same eerie feeling from before returned, the weight of the Watcher's presence hanging in the air. But this time, Caroline wasn't afraid. She knew they were stronger than the forces that had haunted Silverstone for so long. The truth was in their hands now. Caroline took a deep breath and stepped into the center of the mill, standing directly on the spot where the pedestal had been. She raised her arms and spoke, her voice strong and clear. "Silverstone, hear me. The path is not forgotten. The town's history is not lost. We remember. We will not let our memories fade again." For a moment, there was silence. The air seemed to thicken, the weight of centuries of forgotten history pressing down on them. Then, slowly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The walls of the mill seemed to shift, the symbols on the stone walls glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. Caroline felt the air shift, the energy in the room changing, as though something was finally waking. The watchers, who had been silent and hidden, began to appear in the shadows. Their forms flickered, no longer as distant or elusive. They were no longer just observers. They were part of the town's forgotten past, but now, as the townspeople began to remember, their power began to fade. Caroline stepped forward, her voice ringing out. "We remember. Silverstone remembers. The cycle ends here." With that, the figures began to disappear, fading back into the shadows, their presence slowly dissipating. The light in the mill grew brighter, and the air felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from the town. Mark stepped up beside Caroline, his face a mixture of relief and awe. "It's over. We've done it." Caroline nodded, her heart still racing. "It's over. But now the town will remember. And that's what matters." As they stood in the now quiet mill, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting light on the town that had been reborn. Silverstone had faced its past and come out stronger. The watchers were gone, the disappearances were no more, and the town was free to move forward, its memories intact. And for the first time in generations, Silverstone could finally breathe easy. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to Storiosity, and share your favorite moment of this story in the comments below.